Welcome back. I hope you're able to rejoin us. Yes, I believe all the viewers are joining in. And I see Biscuit Sui Generis, which I think is the handle for Janvi Dubey, who I must thank for her contributions to today's address. As I must thank Spriya Bhandari. Both of them, I must tell you, I am digressing, but I must tell you, both of them were law clerks with me, and both of them are successful practitioners today. Janvi is a criminal lawyer, and Spriya is a corporate lawyer who's launching an app which I haven't been able to figure out completely, but which she assures me will revolutionize the legal profession and the court administration by bringing in technology which will make us more efficient. I'm not so sure whether technology will make me more efficient, since I belong to the old school. But enough of the digression. I go back. I was referring to the dissent, the strongly worded dissent of Justice Robert Jackson in Korematsu's case. Now, as I was saying, he called the exclusion order the legalization of racism that violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. He compared the exclusion order to the abhorrent and despicable treatment of minority groups by the dictatorial tyrannies which this nation is now pledged to destroy. And he concluded that the exclusion order violated the 14th Amendment by falling into the ugly abyss of racism. So I'll move on. And this racism, I must tell you, is not limited to any one jurisdiction or any one country. And the next case that I will be referring to is from the United Kingdom, and it's the celebrated case of Liversidge, where Lord Atkin made his reputation as a judge by authoring a dissenting opinion. Now the case again relates to the Second World War. On the background of the case is this: that on the 29th of May 1940, Robert Liversidge, born Jacob Pulswig, who was a pilot officer in the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve, was arrested by a warrant issued by Sir John Anderson, Secretary of State. Liversidge was detained in the Brixton prison pursuant to Regulation 18B. Full stop. He was not charged or accused of criminal conduct, and he was given no reasons for his detention. Full stop. The warrant merely recited that the Home Secretary had reasonable cause to believe that Liversidge was a person of hostile associations. Full stop. At the time of Liversidge versus Anderson, there was understandable public concern about the threat of persons who might support or collaborate with the enemy. In fact, the MI5, the security service in the United Kingdom, was interested in Liversidge as he had access to classified information through his position as a pilot officer in the Royal Air Force. But there were no real grounds, there were no real charges of any misconduct or of any criminal conduct. Now, on 14th of March 1941, Liversidge filed a writ suing the Secretary of State for unlawful detention and claiming damages for false imprisonment. The matter was heard by the trial court and the suit was dismissed. It resulted in an appeal to the King's Bench, which again was dismissed. At this point, Liversidge appealed again to the English Court of Appeal and then to the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords. Now, I must refer now to the majority judgment in Liversidge versus Anderson, which was decided by the usual number of 5 law lords who each delivered a judgment. The case turned on the meaning of the phrase reasonable cause for detention. The central issue that was argued by both sides and determined by the House of Lords was whether the Secretary of State's belief was subject to an objective or a subjective test. Right? I was looking at some of the messages, and I think I can deal with them later. Right. Now, let me go to the majority judgment. The majority judgment held that the Secretary of State's executive decision did not need to be triggered by legally admissible evidence, but could be triggered by hearsay that was extremely confidential or prejudicial to disclose. Also, there were safeguards, including that the Secretary of State was answerable to Parliament and was to report to an advisory committee. Lord Macmillan considered that the wartime context of Regulation 18B was relevant to ascertaining its meaning. Moreover, the Secretary of State, by reason of his position, was entitled to public confidence and belief in his integrity. Lord Wright advised that the use of the word reasonable only connoted that the Secretary of State did not lightly or arbitrarily invade the liberty of the subject. The advisory committee was intended to substitute for recourse to the judiciary if a detainee objected to the decision, and the committee could inform the detainee of the reasons. So was the opinion of Lord Roma. But what this case is famous for and celebrated for is the dissent of by Lord Atkin. And Lord Atkin dissented strongly. He held that the words reasonable cause to believe imposed a standard of reasonableness on the Secretary of State's belief. A subjective belief was not enough, since it would confer an unconditional power of imprisonment. And he went on to make his celebrated quote, where he said, and I quote, "In this country, amid the clash of arms, the laws are not silent. They may be changed, but they speak the same language in war as in peace." Well, I must tell you that the expression used by Lord Atkin's clash of arms is derived from the remarks made by the ancient Roman senator Cicero, who said that the law is not to be interpreted or understood differently in times of war unless Parliament changes the law, which was not the case. Which was not the case in Liversidge. Right, now I should move on because I have taken a lot of time. But before I move on, I must briefly give you a resume of the important judgments that have been rendered in the area of human rights by the Honorable Supreme Court of India and the High Courts. on human rights. Excuse me. I will now begin with some of the recent landmark cases that have shaped certain human rights in India, and one of them, of course, is the constitutionality of the Aadhaar Act, which is reported as K.S. Puttaswamy versus Union of India. Then you have the Sabrimala temple entry case, which is the Indian Young Lawyers Association versus State of Kerala. Then, of course, you have the decriminalization of Section 377 of the IPC, reported as Navtej Johar versus Union of India, and so on and so forth. There's also a case that I would like to refer to, which is the Hadia marriage case, which is cited as Shafeen Jahan versus KM Ashokan, which is on the right of this woman who converted to Islam and married a Muslim in Kerala. It originated in Kerala. But before I go there are a few things I must invite your attention to in relation to the right to work. Now, in the present context, we are in the throes of the COVID-19 epidemic, and it is reported that 122 million laborers in India have been rendered jobless. The Supreme Court has now interfered and directed the central and state governments to make sure, I think this happened yesterday, they've been directed to make sure that the migrant labor who are walking back home are provided with all the necessary humanitarian aid, food, water, roof over their heads, and medical care. And I think there is a direction issued by a 3-judge bench of the Honorable Supreme Court yesterday. But before I come to the current context of the right to work, I must go back to this gentleman called Robert Owen. Now, Robert Owen was a factory owner in the United Kingdom in the 19th century, and he used to run the New Lanark mills. And the manner in which that factory was run gave him credibility not only as a successful businessman, but also as a benevolent employer. Now, he agitated for reform in relation to the rights of laborers and workmen, and argued that competition of human labor with machinery was a permanent cause of distress, and that the only effective remedy lay in the united action of men and the subordination of machinery to man. And he further enunciated that the working classes have been injuriously degraded and oppressed in 3 ways. When they are neglected in infancy, which is child labor; when they are overworked by their employer and thus rendered incompetent from ignorance to make good use of wages when they can procure them; and the third was when they are paid low wages for their labor. And he also berated the administration for employment of children in factories. And importantly, an issue that may assume some significance in the time to come in India as well, he espoused 8-hour work days. He said 8 hours daily labor is enough for any human being, and under proper arrangements sufficient to afford an ample supply of food, raiment and shelter, all the necessaries and comforts of life, and for the remainder of his time every person is entitled to education, recreation, and sleep. Well, that's the reference to Robert Owen in relation to the right to work. Now, what I propose to do is that I will give you a brief address on the development of human rights jurisprudence in the aftermath of globalization, because globalization has raised problems of its own and issues which did not arise for consideration in relation to human rights prior to globalization now hold the field and have to be dealt with on a regular basis. But before that, I will go back to the right to work briefly. And in this regard, I must invite your attention to the decision of the Honorable Supreme Court in Olga Tellis versus Municipal Corporation of Bombay. Now, this is famously, to those who are interested in constitutional law, this is referred to as the pavement dwellers case. Now, the facts were these, that the petitioners used to live in slums and on pavements in the city of Bombay because they had small jobs in the city close to where they resided on the pavements and in these slums. And they were directed to be the Bombay Municipal Corporation, but was taking steps to evict them. The Supreme Court examined the question of right to livelihood and observed that to make living life meaningful, there had to be a means of living, i.e. the means of livelihood. That if the right to livelihood was not treated as a part of the right to life, the easiest way of depriving a person of his right to life would be to deprive him of his means of earning a living. The Supreme Court went on to hold that what makes life possible to live must be deemed to be an integral component of the right to life. For if a person is deprived of his right to livelihood, he shall consequently be deprived of his right to life. For life, as enshrined under Article 21, means more than mere animal existence. Now, this principle was also dealt with in Maneka Gandhi's case and subsequently approved in Gurnam Kaur's case, in Bandhua Mukti Morcha versus Union of India, reported as 1984 3 SCC 161, which was a PIL that highlighted the deplorable condition of bonded laborers in a quarry in Haryana, not far from, just outside Delhi. Asola, if you are familiar with the area, Bhati Mines, that was the area. Now, after Olga Tellis, I mentioned to you that it was approved in the Municipal Corporation of Delhi versus Gurnam Kaur, and where the decision in Olga Tellis was approved. However, in these cases, it was held that nobody has a fundamental right to occupy a particular place on the pavement where he can squat and engage in trade. Full stop. This has been dealt with in the right of there's an act which was subsequently enacted for hawkers to permit them to hawk their wares from certain areas. I think there are a large number of cases in relation to those hawkers and vendors which are still pending before the courts, so I will not comment on that. But I will say that possibly there was some of these findings did not account for the socio-economic compulsions that give rise to pavement dwelling and restrict their examination of the problem from a purely statutory point of view rather than the human rights perspective. This is my critique of some of the findings returned, but I must tell you that fortunately a different note was struck in another decision of the Supreme Court, reported as Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation versus Nawab Khan Gulab Khan, and this related to the eviction of encroachers from a busy locality in Ahmedabad, and the court observed that due to want of facilities and opportunities, the right to residence and settlement is an illusion to the rural and urban poor. Articles 38, 39 and 46 mandate the state as its economic policy to provide socio-economic justice, to minimize inequalities in income and in opportunities and status. It positively charges the state to distribute its largesse to the weaker sections of the society envisaged in Article 46, to make socio-economic justice a reality, meaningful and fruitful, so as to make life worth living with dignity of person and equality of status, and to constantly improve excellence. Full stop. It went on to hold that though no person has a right to encroach and erect structures or otherwise on footpaths, pavements, or public streets, or any other place reserved or earmarked for a public purpose, the state has the constitutional duty to provide adequate facilities and opportunities by distributing its wealth and resources for settlement of life and erection of shelter over the heads of the marginalized sections, and to make their lives meaningful. Well, there are a large number of other judgments on this subject, but I will now start to wind down my address by referring to some of the other spheres in which landmark decisions have been rendered by the Supreme Court. And one of them, as you know, is the decision decriminalizing or reading down Section 377 of the IPC in Navtej Singh Johar. Now, I must tell you that the first round in relation to the challenge to Section 377 of the IPC was the case filed by NAS Foundation. And in the first round, I had occasion to appear on behalf of Union of India and against the NAS Foundation, who were seeking that Section 377 be declared ultra vires. Now, the NAS Foundation, the Delhi High Court dismissed their petition. They went up and appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upheld they reversed the judgment of the Delhi High Court and sent it back for reconsideration on merits to the Delhi High Court. The division bench of the Delhi High Court in its judgment struck down Section 377, and thereafter it was carried an appeal to the Supreme Court and referred to a constitution bench of 5 judges, and the constitution bench of 5 judges has partially struck down Section 377 of the IPC to the extent that it criminalized consensual acts within same-sex relationships. In 4 separate concurring opinions, the court found the penal provision to be discriminatory against individuals on the basis of their sexual orientation. Now, this decision was, I think, rendered in 2018, if I am not mistaken, or 2019. Prior to that, I must tell you that in a decision rendered by me on the 5th of October 2015, which is reported as Shivani Bhatt versus State of NCT of Delhi and others. This is what I had to say about the right of those who are differently sexually oriented to dignity and self-determination. And I will quote from my own judgment, if you will permit me. And I began with a quote from Kabir Das, which said, "Hari se tu mat het kar, kar Hari jan se het. Mal muluk Hari det hai, Hari jan Hari hi det." And I went on to quote Swami Vivekanand when he said that all the powers in the universe are already ours. It is we who have put our hands before our eyes and cry that it is dark. And then I went on to give the operative portion of that decision, where in paragraph 10 I said, every human being has certain inalienable rights. This is a doctrine that is firmly enshrined in our constitution. Gender identity and sexual orientation are fundamental to the right of self-determination, dignity and freedom. These freedoms lie at the heart of personal autonomy and freedom of individuals. A transgender's sense or experience of gender is integral to their core personality and sense of being. Insofar as I understand the law, everyone has a fundamental right to be recognized in their chosen gender. And I refer to the celebrated decision of the Supreme Court in National Legal Services Authority. Then I went on to hold that there is thus no gainsaying the fact that transgenders enjoy basic human rights, including protection from violence and discrimination. They have the right to dignity and self-determination. I also expressed a fervent hope that the time has come for us to mainstream the transgender community. Prejudice is so rampant, so authoritatively practiced, that even families fall prey to its all-pervasive nature. That was the decision rendered in Shivani Bhatt, and it began with a poem from Rabindranath Tagore, and I will read just one paragraph from that poem, where Rabindranath Guruji, as he is known, went on to say, "Go not to the temple to pray on bended knees. First bend down to lift someone who is downtrodden, and strengthen the young ones, not crush them." I think I must now refer to the two decisions which, before I come to the impact of globalization on India, I must refer to two decisions which are seminal and which have come as a shot in the arm for all those who advocate stronger human rights in India. The first is the decision, the Puttaswamy decision of the Constitution Bench on the inalienability of human rights. And in that decision, the Supreme Court, and I quote, observed, "There are certain rights which are natural to or inherent in a human being. Natural rights are not bestowed by the state. They inhere in human beings because they are human. They exist equally in the individual, irrespective of class or strata, gender, or orientation. Natural rights are inalienable because they are inseparable from the human personality. The human element in life is impossible to conceive without the existence of natural rights. And the Supreme Court quoted William Blackstone in his commentaries on the laws of England, where he spoke of absolute rights which were vested in every individual by the immutable laws of nature. It's a long decision, and it's an inspiring decision, and I would at this stage only recommend that all of you give it a read. The other decision that I would like to refer to briefly is this decision in Shafin Jahan's case, which originated from the High Court of Kerala. Now, the facts of the case were this, that Hadia, who was formerly Akhila, was a 24-year-old homeopathic medical student from Vaikom in Kerala. What she did was she married Muhammad Shamin Jahan of her own free will, and also decided to convert to Islam. Now, when the matter came up before the Kerala High Court, the Kerala High Court annulled the marriage of Akhila, now known as Hadia, to Shafin Jahan, and went on to observe that a girl aged 24 years is weak and vulnerable, capable of being exploited in many ways. And the High Court went on to hand over custody of the 24-year-old homeopathic medical student to her parents. Of course, the Shafin Jahan carried the decision of the Kerala High Court to the Supreme Court. And on the 9th of April 2018, a 3-judge bench presided over by Mr. Justice Deepak Mishra, the Chief Justice of India, restored Hadia's right to marry Shafin Jahan as well as embrace Islam by overruling the Kerala High Court judgment on 3 counts. Firstly, the Supreme Court said that the Kerala High Court fell into error in granting parental custody over Hadia after she had testified in open court that she had left her parental house voluntarily, and that the habeas corpus jurisdiction that was exercised by the Kerala High Court to annul her marriage was wrong, and it was accordingly set aside. It also went on to say that the Kerala High Court applied the parens patriae doctrine, where the parens patriae doctrine is normally, as you know, applied in matrimonial jurisdiction, in guardians and wards jurisdiction, where estranged couples fight over the custody of their children, and there the parens patriae doctrine prevails, where the courts are required by law to consider the paramount interest of the child and not the rights of the parents to the custody of the child. So the Supreme Court held that the Kerala High Court should not have exercised parens patriae jurisdiction in this habeas corpus petition, because Hadia was an adult. She had attained majority and she was a medical student. And the Supreme Court finally held that the Kerala High Court transgressed on Hadia's constitutional rights by questioning her right to marry of her own free will a person of her choice, and also the expression of her religious identity, having married Shafin Jahan. So that's as far as Shafin Jahan's judgment is concerned. Now, I've taken a long time. I will now briefly conclude by referring to the conditions that have come about in the aftermath of globalization in India. And for this, I refer to this article authored by Dr. P.V. Deshmukh, who is Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Marathwada University, Aurangabad, Maharashtra. And he says, and I quote him, India accepted new economic policy due to economic crisis in 1990-91. Globalization, privatization, and liberalization are main dimensions of the new economic policy. Since India has changed structural strategy, it took a U-turn on the objectives of 5-year planning that held the field prior to liberalization. Formation of a socialist state, which is a part of India's preamble, was one of the main objectives of the Indian dispensation, of the Indian Constitution. There is considerable scope for the development of poor and common man in a socialist state, since government intervention is part and parcel of the socialist state to regulate economic activities. Economic status plays pivotal role in human rights. The processes of globalization have been increasing economic inequalities and new social problems in India. Public sector has had a decreasing trend due to the reducing government role in the economy. Market-oriented economy favors capitalists and the rich. The intensity of poverty, inequality, unemployment, malnutrition, regional imbalances, terrorism, etc. have been increasing in privatization and globalization era. Environmental degradation is a worrying problem due to exploitation of natural resources in the market-oriented economy. Scarcity of safe and clean water, hunger, poverty, inequality, unemployment, malnutrition, corruption, etc. affect the human's quality of life, and it leads to some basic problems regarding human rights. This is the opinion of Dr. Professor P.V. Deshmukh of the Babasaheb Ambedkar Marathwada University, and I wanted to invite your attention to this because these are problems that according to him have arisen as in the aftermath of globalization. Now I would like to conclude now because I have taken up a lot of your time on today's address. Incidentally, I must tell you that the government of Madhya Pradesh set up a ministry of happiness, and it's I'm informed that there is already a happiness index that is applied in Bhutan to measure the happiness of its people, and arguably Bhutan is supposed to be the happiest country in the world. Of course, what I would like to conclude with is that globalization has been addressed by the UN Secretary General in the backdrop of the current coronavirus pandemic as follows. And I quote the UN Secretary General before I conclude. Antonio Guterres has warned that coronavirus pandemic must not be used as a pretext for authoritarian states to trample over individual human rights or repress the free flow of information. He said what started as a public health emergency has rapidly turned into a human rights crisis. United Nations Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet expressed concern over the condition of migrant workers all over the world and uh, the rising unemployment. In fact, in America, I'm informed that people who applied for unemployment benefits as today breached the 40 million mark, which is more than the population of Canada. Eventually, I will only reiterate the age-old philosophy of India in conclusion, which is Vasudeva Kutumbakam, which elaborates that the entire world is our family, and which says that which negates that we should not talk about me and mine, be small-minded. We must treat the entire world and its and all humanity, all humankind, as our family. Please take human rights seriously. And here I would like to conclude with a personal aside. I have been a lawyer since I was a lawyer for 22 years. I was enrolled at the bar in 1986, and I was a lawyer for 22 years, a senior advocate for about 2.5 years before I was elevated to the bench, and I have been a judge for over 12 years now. But I must tell you that my father before me was a senior advocate at the Supreme Court, and before that he was a judge of the High Court of Judicature at Bombay for a brief period of 2 years. And so I'm a second generation lawyer. And what really prompted me to aspire to become a lawyer when I was young was human rights. I felt deeply about human rights, about the human condition. Those were the days when George Fernandez, Datta Samant, and Jayaprakash Narayan were starting movements for the rights of the poor, the underprivileged, and the workman. And I was also inspired by the teachings of the Buddha, because as a very young child I heard that Buddha, who was born a prince, renounced his life of luxury when he saw poor and sick people on the street. And that was something which had a great influence on shaping my life and my choice of becoming a lawyer as a professional. I thank all of you for being patient. I have taken much longer than I originally intended to, but as I said at the very outset, I hope this has been as much of a learning experience for you as it has been researching the subject for today's address. And hopefully I should one day write a book. I would one day write a book on human rights, and I would greatly treasure inputs from all of you bright researchers and thinkers out there. I thank Professor Batra for having invited me. I thank Virtual Lawyer, and I thank Janvi Sharma. And I now ask Professor Batra to take over. And if there are any queries that you would like answered, we can have an interactive session. Thank you. God bless.
Hello. Thank you so much.
Not at all. Not at all. I know I exceeded all the time barriers
Not
because
at all, sir.
there was just so much to talk about. In fact,
Yes.
I think I've covered just 1/10 of all the material that I had with me. But thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Thank you.
where do we go from here?
I'll just say a few words, then some questions. Which,
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. Please go ahead.
First and foremost, I'd like to thank you for an excellent lecture. It was very moving, very interesting. And your lecture showed how much you feel for human rights of the people. Only when you feel it in the heart can you actually write about human rights, can you actually speak about human rights, or you can actually feel about human rights. You have to feel it in the heart. And I really, really think that you brought it up very well. And I would also thank you for coming on Virtual Lawyer, because it's been picking up over the days. And it was a small, platform which was started by my daughter, and she wanted me to help her out. So it's come up in a big way. And people like you, enlightened people and people who are actually giving justice to the people coming on this platform. It's a learning experience for each one of us. Thank you so much, sir. We will look forward to your books very, very eagerly. And I'm sure you're going to have a number of volumes, because one volume will not suffice. I am sure, because the way you talked about the concept of human rights, the evolution of human rights, and the way you brought it at the international level, and then in India, it was beautifully defined. That is why we have a few questions on every stage. Now, coming to the questions, sir.
Yes, please.
One of the attendees wants to know that we have Article 20, Subclause 3, Indian Constitution, which gives immunity against self-incrimination. Now, when a statement is disclosed under Section 24 of the Evidence Act, under any threat, would it be admissible under Section 27 of the Evidence Act, or it's not possible?
See, Section 27 of the Evidence Act is simple.
Yes.
It is an exclusion to the doctrine that no statement made to a police officer is admissible in evidence. As you know, Section 27 is an exclusion.
Yes.
And the exclusion is very well crafted, it's very well defined. What it says is that if a disclosure made to a police officer results in the discovery of a fact or tangible material, then to that extent of what is discovered, that statement may be used in evidence against the accused. That is the law. Pure and simple. That and no more. What is discovered in consequence upon a disclosure made to a police officer, whether it is a tangible object or an intangible inference to be drawn about the state of mind, it's only that portion is admissible in law at a trial. The rest is not admissible as in evidence.
Thank you, sir. We go to the next question. One attendee wants to know, where do you think capital punishment stands vis-a-vis the human rights of the accused as well as the human rights of the aggrieved?
Well, I think all of us know that the Supreme Court has repeatedly reiterated that capital punishment is to be awarded only in the rarest of rare cases. Right? But and there are any number of judicial decisions on what are the rarest of rare cases. They have, I think, in Nirbhaya's case, what is referred to as Nirbhaya's case, it was considered to be rarest of rare case because the crime was so bestial, the crime was so depraved that the courts felt compelled to award capital punishment. Now, capital punishment engenders a lot of debate, and there are strong voices on either side.
True.
There are those who believe that capital punishment is an anathema in as much as it denudes human beings of their rights.
Yes.
But in India, in India, capital punishment is still a part of our law, and it is for the legislature to consider whether capital punishment must stay on the statute book or it should be done away with, or
Yeah.
whether it should be, as the law commission recommended, limited to only certain categories of cases, whether it should be limited to just those categories of cases, people involved in terrorist activities that have caused or in genocide. But this is an ongoing debate, and I think eventually the ball is squarely and firmly in the court of the legislature, because till such time that capital punishment remains on the statute book,
Yes.
courts will award capital punishment in cases, in the rarest of rare cases, where the offence of which of an individual, the convict is found guilty, is of such depravity and against all human, it's brutal and bestial.
True, sir. True. Thank you, sir. Sir, another question is, what do you think was the watershed moment in Indian human rights jurisprudence?
The watershed moment was, I think, A.K. Gopalan's case, followed by Keshavanand Bharati's case. I didn't refer to all of those cases because they are all pre-globalization, pre-liberalization. But those are the key cases. You see, when you talk about the basic structure of the Constitution, when you talk about how the right to life and personal liberty enshrined in Article 21 cannot be suspended even during an emergency now. After the 44th Amendment, even in a declared emergency, the right to life and personal liberty of persons, not citizens, of persons, cannot be suspended. That's the law now.
Yes.
And the Supreme Court went on to hold in Keshavanand Bharati in the Minerva Mills case what the basic structure is, the doctrine of the basic structure, and what was a part of that basic structure which could not be amended, which could not be suspended in an emergency. Those were watershed moments. Of course, in the recent past, the watershed moment is the judgment in Puttaswamy's case and the right to privacy, because that is a judgment which is landmark even today, and I think it will inspire the judiciary to work harder in pushing the envelope when it comes to human rights.
Yeah. So there's very little time left, but another question I can ask you is, why has the National Human Rights Commission been given only, the power to recommend and not actually take it?
Yes, actually, that's a question that arises quite often. And again, as I said, that is in the domain of the legislature. Eventually, the act should have ideally, the legislature should have taken it further, because today the Human Rights Commission, as you said, can only recommend. Eventually, yes, it is for the courts to issue directions seeking implementation and compliance with the observance of human rights. So that's something that the government and the parliament should consider, whether the Human Rights Act, which was enacted, I think, in 1993, if I am not mistaken, whether it needs to be amended and the Human Rights Commission should be given more teeth. Yeah. Yes, I would recommend that the parliament consider it seriously.
So, last question. You talked about Cyrus Declaration. Your history is so... Cyrus Declaration.
Yes, the Cyrus Cylinder. Yes.
Yeah. So the essence which was there, do we find it in the Indian Constitution also?
Well, the essence of the Cyrus Cylinder is the liberation of the Jews, and they're being freed from slavery in Babylon and returned to Jerusalem and Israel. Yes. And it was the first instance of religious tolerance and respect for individuals who professed a faith other than the one professed by an emperor or a king or a conqueror. and the acceptance that you could profess another faith and you would still be treated equally, and that you had every right to profess your own faith. Of course, it is reflected in the Indian Constitution. We have the right to religious freedom. We have religious tolerance. I delivered a lecture on religious tolerance where I said that India has practiced religious tolerance since the time the Syrian Christians came to India in 24 AD.
Yes, true,
Which is almost 2000 years ago. We've practiced religious freedom since before then.
True, yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. I think we have to wrap up now. And again, on behalf of Janvi, on behalf of everybody who is attending and not attending, and maybe see it later, thank you so much for being on this platform. And maybe we can call you again, sir, in the coming months, because I think COVID-19 is not going to leave us very soon. And the courts probably physically, we may not be able to really attend over there. Thank you so much, sir.
It's been a pleasure, and it's been a learning experience for me as well. Thank you so much. Yeah. Jai Hind. God bless.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.